The dog had not moved from the doorway in 4 hours. Not for the meal cart, its wheel catching on the same tile every time it rattled past. Not for the night resident, who crouched down and murmured a name that wasn't the dog's. The woman with the flowers stopped to ask if she could pet him, and got a slow blink for an answer, nothing more. Then a man in a gray coat stepped off the elevator, and 90 pounds of retired police K9 came off the floor like something had gone off in the room. Maren Sutter felt it before she understood it, the change in the air of the corridor, the way every quiet machine on the floor kept ticking along exactly as it had, and only the dog reacted. She was 34 years old, 6 hours into a 12-hour shift, and she had been left alone with a patient in critical but stable condition and an animal with a discharge file that read like a warning label. Every report written that night would call what came next aggression. Not one of them would ask what the dog had been standing guard over. It started at handoff. The charge nurse had her coat half on already, talking fast, the way people talked when they wanted to be somewhere else. Room 412, post-op, stable. The service dog stays with him per family request, cleared by administration. Don't ask her why. If he does anything at all, that's on you tonight. Maren nodded, because nodding was faster than arguing, and because the floor was down to a skeleton crew and there was no one left to hand the problem to. For the first 2 hours he was furniture. He lay with his chin on his paws and his eyes half open. The meal cart came and went. A resident checked the patient's vitals and didn't so much as glance down at him. 3 times, nothing. Maren logged each one out of habit, more than concern. Dog calm, dog unresponsive to visitors. Then the elevator doors opened. She didn't see the man's face first. She saw the dog. He was up before the doors had finished sliding apart. Weight shifted forward onto his front legs, a low sound coming out of him that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a bark. The man crossed the hall in an unhurried walk. Mid-40s, gray wool coat, the kind of face that arranged itself into something warm and apologetic before it had even reached you. "Whoa," he said, stopping a few feet from the door. He's fine, it's just me." Maren was already moving, one hand finding the leash clipped to the wall bracket, her body between the dog and the door before she'd decided to put it there. "Sir, can I ask who you are?" "Curtis," he said, smiling at her like this was a small and forgivable misunderstanding. "Curtis Adair. Harlan's my father-in-law." He nodded past her, toward the man asleep in the bed. "I try to come by most nights. Guess your dog and I haven't been properly introduced." She got a hand on the dog's harness and felt the tension in him like a drawn cable, every muscle coiled and ready, and still he didn't lunge, just stood there radiating a kind of focused, contained alarm that unsettled her more than any amount of noise would have. She pulled him back half a step. He let her. His eyes never left the man in the gray coat. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it, because it was easier to apologize to the visitor than to sit with the tight, sour pull low in her stomach. "It's fine," Curtis said, already stepping past her, already reaching for the door. "He doesn't know me yet." Maren stood holding the leash a moment longer than she needed to, watching him go in, watching the door swing almost shut behind him, and something in the sentence snagged on her, the way a splinter snags on skin, small, easy to ignore, impossible to stop noticing. "He doesn't know me yet. Not I don't come by much, not we haven't met properly," the ordinary thing a stranger would say. He'd said it like the dog was the one behind, like the dog simply hadn't caught up yet to a truth everyone else already knew. She wrote one line in the shift log, because that was procedure. Dog reactive to visitor, Curtis Adair, family. No incident, monitoring. Then she looked back down the hall at the closed door of 412 and realized that in 4 hours of watching that man's family come and go, no one had ever once introduced Curtis Adair to her by name. He had done it himself. And he'd done it like a man clearing something off the record before anyone thought to ask. By the time Curtis left, 40 minutes later, Maren had built herself a comfortable little theory and was standing inside it like a coat 2 sizes too big. New dog, strange man. Dogs got funny about strangers, especially service dogs pulled out of harder work, dogs with history nobody had bothered to write down properly. It wasn't complicated, it didn't need to be complicated. She had a 12-hour shift and a patient whose vitals needed checking every 20 minutes, and a stack of charting that wasn't going to do itself, and she did not have room, tonight, for a theory that required her to distrust a grieving family member with sad eyes and good manners. She told herself this twice, out loud, quietly, at the nurse's station, and both times it worked a little less than the time before. Curtis came back 2 nights later. He found her at the station and asked, with the kind of practiced softness that made her feel almost rude for hesitating, if he could have just a few minutes alone with Harlan, just to talk, just the two of them, man to man, nothing medical, nothing she needed to be part of. She checked the chart. No contraindication, no restriction on visitors, she said of course, and watched him go in and closed the door most of the way behind him because that was what families asked for and it wasn't her place to refuse it. She didn't think about it again until she went to log the visit and noticed, flipping back through the shift record out of nothing more than tidiness, that this made four times in 11 days that Curtis Adair had asked for the room alone. She hadn't counted before because there had been no reason to count. Now, with a pen in her hand and a blank line waiting under visitor notes, the number sat there looking larger than it should have. She told herself it meant nothing. Grief did that to people. Grief made a man want privacy with his dying father-in-law, wanted it enough to ask for it again and again, and there was nothing sinister in a son-in-law who visited often and asked for space. Except Harlan wasn't dying, he was recovering. Slowly, unevenly, but recovering. The surgeons had been clear about that, cautiously optimistic, a phrase Maren had read in his chart herself that morning. She pulled up the dog's file instead, telling herself it was only curiosity, only due diligence, the kind of thing any careful nurse would do with an animal on her floor overnight. What she found was almost nothing: a name, Bear, an age. A note, 3 words long, buried under a stack of vaccination records. Behavioral discharge, K9 unit. No incident report attached, no explanation, just those 3 words sitting there like a locked door with no handle. She was still looking at the screen when her phone buzzed, Harlan's daughter, calling from 2 states away, her voice thick with the particular exhaustion of a person managing a crisis from a distance. She thanked Maren for everything, asked the ordinary questions, and then, almost as an afterthought, said that Curtis had really stepped up, hadn't he, taking care of all the paperwork, all the insurance calls, everything so she didn't have to fly out every week. Such a relief, having someone she could trust with all of it. Maren said yes, of course, that must be a relief, and hung up feeling the unease from 2 nights ago tighten 1 notch further, a small, precise turn like a key finding its lock. She went back to the shift log, out of a habit that was starting to feel less like tidiness and more like something she couldn't stop doing, and laid the 2 records side by side in her head. 4 times Curtis had asked to be alone with Harlan. 4 times, cross-referenced against her own scrawled notes on the dog. The animal had come up off the floor the moment that door opened for him and gone still and low the moment it closed behind him. Every single time. She sat with that for a full minute, pen resting against the page, watching the pattern surface slowly, taking clearer shape the longer she stayed still and let it settle. 4 for 4, not almost every time, every time. Then she did what she had been doing all night, the thing that had gotten easier with practice. She talked herself out of it. Coincidence had a way of looking like conspiracy if you stared at it too long in an empty hallway at 3 in the morning. She was tired. She was projecting a decade-old fear onto a man who brought his father-in-law visits and a dog who probably just didn't like cologne, or wool coats, or men who moved a certain way. She closed the logbook. She went to check on a patient 2 doors down who actually needed her. She told herself, walking away, that she had imagined the pattern into being. That was easier to carry than the alternative. She didn't see it when she left, didn't see the dog rise from where he'd been lying near the foot of the bed, cross the small room in 3 unhurried steps, and settle himself directly in the doorway of 412, facing out into the hall, the exact position he'd held for 4 hours the first night she'd met him. By the time she came back to switch off the desk lamp and finish her charting, he was already there, a dark shape low against the light, spilling from the room behind him, perfectly still, ears pricked toward the elevator at the end of the hall, eyes fixed on it with a patience that had nothing restless in it at all. She noted it in passing, dog by doorway again, nothing new, and didn't think, not yet, to ask herself what he thought he was guarding it from. Curtis asked for his few minutes alone at 11:40 that night, and Maren, 3 doors down and out of pharmacy stock, told him to go ahead. She had a reason to be gone. That was the part she would replay later, over and over, until the replaying wore a groove in her. She hadn't left the floor because she wanted to give him privacy. She'd left because the medication cart was 2 rooms away, and Harlan's next dose was due in 15 minutes, and there was no version of her job that let her stand outside a closed door all night, watching a man visit his father-in-law. She had work, she did the work. She counted out the dose twice, the way she always did, checked the label against the chart, checked it again, because that was the kind of nurse she was, and had been every single night since the one that had taught her to be exactly this careful and not 1 ounce more careless. She was gone maybe 6 minutes. In those 6 minutes, she restocked 2 other rooms, answered a call light down the hall, and told herself, walking back with the cartwheels squeaking against the tile, that the small unease sitting under her ribs was nothing, was only tiredness, was the kind of low hum that came with hour 9 of any overnight shift. She had almost convinced herself of it by the time she reached the door to 412. The hallway at that hour had its own particular sound, the low mechanical chorus of a hospital at rest, a distant elevator chime, the soft click of a nurse's shoes 2 floors up carried strangely through the ductwork, the endless small percussion of monitors keeping time in rooms she couldn't see. The door was open a few inches more than families usually left it, and through the gap she caught a slice of the room, the low blue wash of the nightlight, the shape of Curtis standing, not sitting, standing beside the bed with his back half turned to the door. She almost kept walking. That was the thing about the 6 seconds that followed, how close they came to happening to an empty hallway, to nobody, to a version of this story where she was already at the next room and heard about it secondhand, the way everyone else on the floor would. Curtis reached across the bed, not toward Harlan, toward the smart infusion pump mounted on its pole beside him, his hand closing around the housing where the dosing panel sat, his thumb already moving toward the small lit screen. It was such a small, ordinary-looking motion. A man adjusting a machine, the kind of thing a worried relative might do out of nervous habit, reaching for something to fuss with because there was nothing else in the room he was allowed to fix. If she hadn't been standing exactly where she was standing, at exactly that angle, she would never have registered it as anything at all. She didn't have time to call out. Bear came off the floor and through the gap in the door in one motion, no bark first, no warning growl, 90 pounds of dog, crossing 8 feet of room faster than Maren's mind could process what she was watching. And then he had Curtis's wrist in his mouth, Curtis shouting and stumbling back against the wall-mounted monitor, and the machine's alarm went off at almost the same instant. A high, thin beeping that seemed to come from very far away, layered under the sound of Curtis's voice climbing into something raw and frightened, and, underneath that, something else Maren couldn't quite name yet. Maren was already moving. She got both hands on Bear's harness and pulled with everything she had, and he released clean, no shaking, no second bite, the way a trained animal releases when the job is done and not a second before, and stood between her and Curtis with his head low and his eyes fixed, and that same not quite growl rolling out of his chest, low and steady, like an engine idling. "Get him out," Curtis said, cradling his forearm against his chest, his voice climbing. "Get that thing out of here. He attacked me. He actually attacked me." 2 other staff members were already in the doorway by then, drawn by the alarm, and the room filled fast with the particular chaos of people responding to an emergency that had already peaked before they arrived. Someone silenced the pump. Someone got the overhead light on, flooding the room in a harsh white that made everything look smaller and more real than it had a moment before. Someone else was already reaching for the crash cart, out of pure reflex before realizing it wasn't that kind of emergency. Maren knelt with Bear's leash wrapped twice around her fist, feeling him tremble now that the moment had passed, his whole body still coiled with the aftershock of whatever instinct had just moved through him, and looked up at Curtis's arm as a colleague peeled back his sleeve. Her own hands weren't steady either, she noticed distantly, a faint, unfamiliar tremor, as if they belonged to someone standing just behind her. The bite had torn the fabric and left a mark along the outside of his wrist, she could see that much, before someone reached for gauze and began wrapping it clean and white, layer over layer, carefully, the kind of wrapping meant to keep people from looking too closely, not his palm. Not the vein, the outside of the wrist, the part he would have turned away from the machine, not toward it, if his hand had simply been resting at his side, and nothing more. Harlan stirred in the bed through all of it, groggy, blinking against the sudden brightness, murmuring something none of them caught, and someone leaned in to reassure him that everything was fine, everything was under control, go back to sleep now. "That dog needs to be gone tonight," Curtis said, already turning it into a sentence for the record, already choosing which 4 seconds of the last minute would survive into the paperwork. "I want it documented. He came at me with no provocation. I didn't even—" He stopped there, breathing hard, and let someone lead him toward a chair near the window, where a colleague crouched to check his pulse and murmur something soothing. Maren opened her mouth to say what she'd seen, his hand on the pump, his thumb near the panel, the half-second before Bear moved, and heard how it sounded even as the words were leaving her. Too specific, too convenient. A nurse who'd left the room defending the dog that had just drawn blood from a visiting family member, describing a detail no one else in the hallway had been positioned to see. She said it anyway, quietly, to the colleague filling out the incident report, who nodded without really listening and kept writing. Nobody wrote it down. She watched the pen move across the form, watched the shape of the sentence being built without her, and by the time it was finished it read clean and simple and wrong. Nurse left patient unattended with animal, visitor injured, left unattended, as if Harlan had been the one in danger. As if the 6 minutes she'd spent getting his medication were the failure in the room, and not whatever Curtis Adair's hand had been doing 3 feet from a dosing panel while no one but a dog was watching. She stood there holding the leash long after anyone needed her to, looking at Curtis's bandaged wrist, at the pump now silent and dark on its pole, at Bear sitting very still beside her with his ears still turned toward the door, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that whatever had actually happened in this room in the last 6 minutes, only one version of it was going to survive until morning. She set the leash down on the counter, looked once more at the closed door of 412, and walked back down the hall alone, the sound of Curtis's voice still drifting from the chair by the window behind her. The clinical review board met at 9 the next morning, in a room with white walls and a white board that still carried the ghost of someone else's shift notes, half erased along one corner, where a hand had tried and failed to wipe it clean. Maren sat on one side of a long table, with her hands folded in front of her like a student called to the principal's office, exhausted in the particular way that came from working a full night shift and then not sleeping through the morning that followed it, and watched Curtis Adair take the seat across from her with his forearm in a fresh dressing and an expression of careful, aching patience. He was good. She understood that within the first 2 minutes, with the same flat certainty as a fact about weather, not with alarm, just with the flat recognition of something that simply is. He didn't accuse her, he didn't raise his voice. He described the bite in a level, almost embarrassed tone, a man reluctant to make trouble, glancing down at his bandaged arm every so often, as if the sight of it still surprised him. When someone asked whether the nurse's absence from the room had concerned him, he said gently that he didn't want anyone to think he was blaming her. She'd clearly been overwhelmed, running a floor alone overnight. And honestly, he added, he was more worried about what might happen to the next family that dog was left alone with. It was a masterclass in not attacking. He made himself sympathetic to her exhaustion at the exact moment he was making the case that would end her access to the room. He used the word concerned 3 times, and the word blame not once, and Maren watched 3 people at the table nod along with him, their pens moving, their faces arranging themselves into the particular sympathy people reserve for a man who has clearly been hurt and is being remarkably gracious about it. Her chest tightened, a slow contraction like a fist closing around something she hadn't known was still soft. Someone asked him, almost as an aside, whether he had any explanation for why the dog might have reacted the way it did. Curtis considered the question with the air of a man giving it real, generous thought. "Animals pick up on things," he said finally. "Maybe he sensed I was upset. Harlan's condition weighs on all of us. I don't pretend to understand dogs." It was the kind of answer that closed a door so gently nobody in the room noticed it had shut. One board member even murmured something sympathetic about how stressful this must be for the whole family, and Curtis accepted it with a small, tired nod, exactly the reaction of a man too gracious to say so himself. When it was her turn, Maren laid it out as plainly as she could. The 4 visits Curtis had asked for alone, cross-referenced against 4 instances of Bear's reaction. The half-second before the bite, his hand on the pump housing, his thumb moving toward the panel, not toward Harlan. She kept her voice level, kept her hands still on the table in front of her, and used the word pattern once, and regretted it immediately, because the moment it left her mouth, she heard how it sounded to a room full of people who hadn't been standing in that hallway. She tried to walk it back, to soften it into something closer to a timeline, a sequence of observed events, and watched the softening only make it sound weaker. Watched the board chair's expression settle into something that was less skepticism than simple, tired patience, the look of someone waiting for a story to reach a point it was never going to reach. She had prepared for this moment on the drive in, rehearsing it in the empty car the way she used to rehearse presentations back in nursing school, and every version had sounded reasonable in her own head. In the room, under the fluorescent lights, with Curtis's bandaged arm resting on the table across from her like a piece of evidence nobody had to argue for, every sentence she'd rehearsed came out sounding smaller than she'd meant it to. She kept waiting for someone to ask a follow-up question that would let her explain further, and nobody did. They simply let her finish and moved on, with the practiced ease of a committee moving past an item it had already decided not to pursue. The board chair, a woman with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, listened without interrupting, and waited until Maren finished before she asked the question that ended the meeting before it had really begun. "You're asking us to trust a dog's opinion about a man." Maren didn't have an answer for that, not one that would survive being said out loud in this room, to these people, on a morning when the only physical evidence anyone could point to was wrapped in white gauze on Curtis Adair's arm. She could have said yes. She could have said that in 11 days on this floor, the dog had been right about something 4 times running, and she had been right about nothing except how to explain it away. But the sentence felt too large for the room, too strange to survive contact with the fluorescent lights, and the whiteboard, and the smell of burnt coffee from the machine in the corner. She said nothing instead, and watched the silence do exactly as much damage as the wrong words would have. No one moved to fill the quiet that followed. Someone shuffled a stack of papers unnecessarily. Someone else glanced at the clock on the wall, the kind of glance that meant the meeting, in every practical sense, was already over, whatever formalities still had to happen around it. The decision came within the hour, delivered by the program coordinator in a private hallway conversation rather than in front of the full board, which felt, to Maren, like its own small mercy and its own small cruelty at once. Bear's certification as an active facility animal was suspended pending a behavioral evaluation, a term that, from the careful way he phrased it, avoiding her eyes for most of the sentence, she understood to be one soft step away from removal altogether. He told her he was sorry. He told her none of this reflected on her. He told her that sometimes an animal simply couldn't be trusted around certain kinds of stress anymore, no matter its record, and that the hospital had to think about liability first and everything else second. She asked what would happen to Bear during the evaluation period, and he admitted, after a pause, that he wasn't entirely sure. That decision belonged to the program office, not the hospital. She asked once if anyone could pull the pump's internal log, just to see, just to rule it out, just so there'd be one piece of this that wasn't built entirely out of what two people said they remembered. The answer came fast and final. That request would need to go through biomedical engineering, and it wasn't within a floor nurse's authority to request it directly. Not without a reason the hospital recognized as sufficient, and a feeling, however specific, was not a reason. He said it kindly. It didn't feel kind. She left the meeting room and found Curtis at the front desk, already there, already signing something, his bandaged hand steadying a clipboard while he wrote with the other, his coat draped over the counter beside him like he'd been standing there for a while. She slowed without meaning to. The header of the top page, upside down from where she stood, was easy enough to read anyway. Transfer request. He looked up and caught her looking, and for just a second, before the practiced warmth reassembled itself over his face, she saw something underneath it that wasn't warmth at all. It lasted less than a second, but it left its mark on her anyway, his jaw tightening, his eyes going flat and assessing for one bare instant before the warmth slid back into place. A flicker, gone almost before she could be sure she'd seen it. Then he smiled, said something polite about paperwork and insurance and getting Harlan settled somewhere with better long-term care, closer to specialists, a facility his firm's insurance actually covered in full, and went back to signing. Maren walked the rest of the hallway without really seeing it, past the supply closet, past the vending machines humming their tired hum, past a window where the morning light had turned flat and gray with the promise of rain. Through the glass partition near the nurse's station, she could see Bear lying in the hall outside 412, exactly where he always lay, facing the door the way he'd faced it since the first night she met him, as if suspension didn't mean anything to an animal that had only ever understood one job, and no one had told him yet that the job had just been taken away. She stood there a long moment, watching him breathe, watching the slow, unhurried rhythm of it, and thought that at least one creature on this floor still believed the door was worth guarding, even now that no one in charge believed him. The letter came through the family, not through the hospital, which was its own kind of message. Maren read it standing at the nurse's station with her coffee going cold beside her. 3 short paragraphs written in the flattened, careful language of someone who'd had a lawyer look it over first. Effective immediately, the family was requesting that Nurse Sutter be reassigned from Mr. Ashby's care. No allegation of wrongdoing, no complaint filed, only a quiet procedural request that any hospital in the country would honor without asking why, because families were allowed to ask for a different nurse, and nobody needed a reason better than discomfort. She read it twice, then a third time, waiting to feel something sharper than the flat, sinking weight that had settled into her instead. She wasn't being blamed. That was the strange, hollow shape of it. Nobody was accusing her of anything. She was simply, cleanly, being moved out of the way inconvenient furniture gets moved out of a walkway. The charge nurse found her 20 minutes later and delivered the rest of it standing in the break room doorway, arms crossed, not because she was unkind, but because there was no gentle way to say it, and she'd clearly decided the kindest thing she could do was say it fast. Nobody thought Maren had done anything wrong. Everybody understood the family had every right to make this request. And there was one more thing. The family had arranged a bed at a private long-term care facility across the state line, and Harlan would be transferred there within 48 hours. 48 hours. Maren heard the number and felt it land somewhere behind her sternum, a small physical weight, the exact shape of a door closing that hadn't been slammed, only pulled quietly shut by someone with every legal right to do it. She asked, out of some reflex she didn't examine too closely, whether the transfer had been discussed with Harlan himself, whether he'd had any say in it, and the charge nurse's silence answered the question more thoroughly than any words would have. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, that a man barely a week out of surgery, still confused half the time he woke, was in no position to have a say in anything, and that everyone signing these papers knew it. She thought about the machine that hadn't cared what anyone did or didn't feel guilty about the night her second patient, years ago, had crashed on her watch, the alarm that had gone off exactly on schedule, whether or not she'd chosen, that one time, to trust the small, uneasy feeling she'd had and hadn't acted on. She had promised herself something after that night. Some version of never again, had built her entire career on the promise, checked every dose twice, trusted every gut feeling enough to write it down even when she didn't act on it. And here she was again, except this time she had spoken up, and it hadn't mattered at all. Silence had cost her a patient once, speaking had cost her this room. Both roads led here, to a hallway, to a closed door, to a version of herself standing outside looking in, and she couldn't tell anymore which failure to be more afraid of. The break room kept moving around her, ordinary and indifferent, a coffee pot gurgling through its cycle, a colleague laughing quietly at something on her phone 2 tables over, ordinary noise pressing in on a morning that didn't feel ordinary to Maren at all. She wondered, standing there with the letter still in her hand, whether there had ever been a third road at all, or whether she'd simply never found it. She thought, too, about all the small choices that had brought her to this exact hallway, on this exact morning. The decision to write down the pattern instead of ignoring it. The decision to speak it out loud in a room full of people who hadn't wanted to hear it. The decision, even now, to keep caring about a family that had just quietly asked to be rid of her. None of those choices had been wrong, not one of them, and all of them together had still landed her here, holding a letter that ended her presence in a room she had fought this hard to stay in. She asked, because she was owed at least this much, if she could see Harlan one more time before the shift change reassigned her elsewhere. The charge nurse, to her credit, didn't make her ask twice. He was more awake than she'd seen him in days, propped up against the pillows, his color better, his eyes tracking her across the room with something that looked almost like relief. The morning light through the blinds striped the blanket across his chest, and for a moment, watching him, Maren let herself believe things might still be salvageable, that there was still a version of this where she got to keep doing the one part of her job that had never once felt like a burden. She checked his vitals out of habit more than duty now, adjusted his blanket, straightened the cup of water on his tray table, all the small unnecessary tasks a person does when they don't want a visit to end, and found his hand closing around her wrist when she reached to log his numbers. "You've been good to me," he said, his voice thin and unhurried, a man rebuilding sentences out of a fog that was only just starting to lift. "Better than you had to be." She told him it was her job. He shook his head, slow, and held on, his grip weaker than it should have been for a man his size, weaker than it had been even a week ago, and that alone told her something about what these last weeks had cost him. "Every time," he said, and stopped, gathering the thought slowly, as if it kept slipping out of reach before he could close his hand around it. "Every time he sits with me alone a while, I wake up worse, feel it in my chest, thought it was just getting older, getting tired." His grip tightened, just slightly, around her wrist. "Didn't think anything of it till just now, till you asked." Maren went very still. It was the first thing anyone in this building had said out loud that matched exactly what she'd already believed, and it arrived at the one moment she had no authority left to do anything with it. Not a nurse assigned to his care anymore. Not someone the hospital would let anywhere near his chart by morning. A witness with nothing but a sentence, standing in a room she was about to be asked to leave, holding the one piece of testimony that might have changed everything if it had only come a day sooner from someone the review board would have believed. She wanted, badly, to ask him more, how many times, how bad, whether he'd told anyone else, but she could already hear footsteps in the corridor, already feel the minutes of this visit running out under her. The door opened before she could ask any of it. Curtis stood there, coat over one arm, smiling the smile that had gotten him through every room in this hospital so far, and said gently that he hated to interrupt, but visiting hours and shift changes were what they were, and perhaps it was best if Harlan got his rest before the trip tomorrow. She let go of Harlan's hand. She had no ground left to stand on that would let her refuse, and she watched something close behind Harlan's eyes as Curtis crossed the room toward him, some flicker of the same weariness she'd seen in Bear 100 times now, quickly smoothed over into the practiced neutrality of a man who had learned, somewhere in these last weeks, not to let his face say what he was thinking. Out in the hallway, through the glass, she found Bear where he always was, lying just outside the door of 412 with his chin on his paws, watching the same stretch of corridor he'd been watching for days, except now it was Maren standing on the wrong side of a threshold she'd never once thought of as a boundary, in exactly the position he had held the very first night she'd met him. She understood, looking at him, that the room had just closed to both of them, for exactly the same reason, and that neither of them had a single official channel left to argue it. She didn't go home when her shift ended. She stood at the nurse's station a long moment, staring at the internal directory on the desktop screen, scrolling past extensions she'd never once needed to call, and then dialed one she had never once had reason to use before tonight. Biomedical Equipment Services, 3 floors down, the kind of number that existed for broken monitors and recalled devices, not for anything she was about to ask it to answer. The biomedical shop lived in the basement, past a service corridor that smelled of warm plastic and floor wax, past shelves of retired equipment waiting on calibration stickers and a bulletin board gone yellow with age. Tova Morales was still at her bench when Maren found her, headphones around her neck, a pump housing open in front of her like something being autopsied under the yellow light of a desk lamp, tools laid out in a neat row that suggested a person who had never once lost a screw. She didn't ask why Maren was down here at the end of a shift that wasn't supposed to include her anymore. She didn't ask about the review board, or the transfer, or any of the things that had by now made their way through the hospital's grapevine in the particular garbled shorthand these things always traveled in. She just glanced up once, took in whatever she saw on Maren's face, and asked for the serial number off the pump from 412, wrote it on a sticky note, turned to her terminal like the rest of it was somebody else's weather. The basement at this hour had its own weather too, cooler than the floors above, the hum of the building's mechanical systems louder down here, closer to the bone, a low steady thrum that ran under everything Tova said like a second, quieter voice. Maren hadn't noticed, until she stood still in it, how loud the hospital actually was underneath its polished quiet. She wondered how many other quiet certainties were humming away down here, unnoticed, holding up floors of people who never once thought to ask what kept them standing. "Machines don't have opinions," Tova said, not looking up, typing with the quick, unhesitating rhythm of someone who spent most of her working life inside systems other people found impenetrable. "People do, that's usually the problem." Maren stood behind her shoulder while the log loaded, lines of time-stamped data scrolling past too fast to read, and made herself breathe slowly while Tova scrolled back through 6 days of routine infusion history, flow rate confirmations, standard adjustments, the unremarkable rhythm of a machine doing exactly what it was told, over and over, until it wasn't. Every few seconds Tova muttered something under her breath, a running commentary Maren couldn't quite follow, a technician's private language of timestamps and firmware versions and calibration windows that meant nothing to her and everything, apparently, to Tova. Tova stopped scrolling, highlighted a line, read it twice, out loud, in a flat technical voice that made the words sound smaller than they were, smaller than the weight Maren felt land in her chest the moment she heard them. Dose rate reprogrammed manually. Outside standing order, 2344. Maren's whole chest tightened. 1144. The exact window Curtis had asked to be alone with Harlan, the same night, the same 6 minutes she'd been 3 doors down fetching medication that hadn't needed to be fetched that urgently, the same 6 minutes she'd spent replaying every day since as the moment she should have stayed. It matched. Down to the minute, it matched the line she'd written by hand in her own shift log, the one nobody at the review board had wanted to look at twice. She put a hand over her mouth without meaning to and felt her eyes go hot, and for a moment the only sound in the room was the low hum of the equipment shelves and her own breath catching. It wasn't triumph. It was something closer to relief, so sudden it hurt. The physical sensation of a weight she'd been carrying since the review board finally having somewhere to set itself down. She hadn't imagined it. She hadn't built a shape out of nothing in an empty hallway at 3 in the morning. It was here, in black text on a gray screen, time-stamped, real, exactly where a machine had quietly kept it the whole time nobody else was willing to look. "There," Tova said, and didn't reach for a tissue or a shoulder or any of the things a kinder scene might have called for. She just kept looking at the screen, arms folded, her face unreadable in the desk lamp's yellow light. A woman who dealt in evidence and had never quite learned what to do with someone else's tears. "That's your reprogram." Maren looked at the timestamp again, as if looking at it a second time might make it feel less enormous, and found that it didn't. Maren wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist and asked the only question that mattered now. Could she pull this, print it, copy it, hand it to someone who'd listen? Was this enough? Tova was quiet a second too long before she answered, and when she did, her voice had lost some of its flatness. "It's enough to know something happened." A pause, longer than the first. "It might not be enough to know who did it." Maren didn't understand yet what she meant by that. Not fully. The sentence landed and sat there. A small stone dropped into still water, ripples she couldn't read the shape of. Somewhere above them, 3 floors up, a clock she couldn't see was still running, roughly 44 hours now, until the transfer, and she'd used 4 of the 48 already sitting in this basement, feeling for the first time in days like she had something solid in her hands. She let herself sit with that feeling a moment longer than she probably should have, because it had been so long since anything in this building had felt solid at all. Tova leaned back from the terminal, tapped a few more keys, went still, and read something on the screen that made her stop moving altogether, her fingers hovering over the keyboard without pressing anything, her expression sliding from technical focus into something more careful, more reluctant. She pulled her headphones the rest of the way off her neck and set them down on the bench, a small gesture that somehow made the room feel more serious than anything she'd said yet. "You're not going to like the next part," she said. "This model doesn't lock sessions to a badge," Tova said, turning the screen slightly so Maren could see it too. "Any staff member standing at the bedside can key in a change. It logs the action. It doesn't log the hand that did it." Maren stared at the line on the screen and felt the relief of 10 minutes ago curdle into something else entirely. The screen held no user ID field, no badge scan, only a timestamp and a keypad entry, anonymous by design, because the machine had been built to trust that whoever stood close enough to touch it belonged there. It had never once occurred to whoever engineered it that someone standing close enough to touch it might not. "So, it doesn't prove Curtis did it," she said, already hearing where this was going, the floor tilting slightly under a hope she'd been standing on for less than 15 minutes. "It proves someone did." Tova scrolled further, and her mouth went tight in a way that told Maren the worst part hadn't arrived yet. "Problem is, the access log for the room shows 2 badge swipes in that window. His visitor badge, a beat, and yours. You came back in to check on the patient 9 minutes later, remember? Standard round. It's right here," Maren remembered. Of course she remembered. She'd walked in to find him standing over the bed. She'd pulled Bear off his wrist with her own 2 hands. She had been in that room because something was already wrong. But the log didn't know any of that. The log knew 2 names, 2 swipes, 1 unlocked machine, and no way on earth to tell a reader which of those 2 people had actually touched the panel. 2 names, sitting side by side on a printout, equally guilty until somebody with more authority than either of them decided otherwise. She had gone looking for the one piece of evidence in this entire nightmare that wasn't built out of what people chose to remember, and she had found a machine with a perfect memory and absolutely no ability to tell the truth apart from her. She sat down slowly on the stool beside Tova's bench, the metal cold through her scrub pants, and stared at the printout without really seeing it anymore, the 2 names blurring together into a single gray smear of letters. "Could you write it up?" Maren asked, hearing the strain in her own voice. "Explain the limitation, just so it's on record what the log can and can't say?" Tova nodded slowly, already reaching for a form. "I can note the badge ambiguity. I can note the timestamp. What I can't do is tell them who's lying." She looked up, and for the first time all night, something like sympathy crossed her face, brief and businesslike. "For what it's worth, I believe you. That's not the same as this file believing you." Her voice had gone flat and careful, the tone of someone delivering news she wished were different, and she went back to her form without waiting for Maren to answer, because there wasn't really an answer to give. The pen moved in short, precise strokes as Tova filled out the form, and Maren thought that this was probably the most honest sentence anyone in this building had said to her in 3 days, and it still wasn't enough to change a single thing that was about to happen. When Tova tore the sheet free and held it out, Maren thanked her anyway, because it was the only thing left in the room worth being grateful for, and gathered the printout with hands that had gone strangely careful, as if the paper itself might tear apart the little bit of ground she still had left to stand on. It got worse within the hour, the way things in this hospital had a habit of doing exactly when Maren thought she'd reached the bottom of it. A formal complaint arrived through the family's attorney, not against Bear this time, not even against Curtis's own account of the bite, against her. The hospital's own compliance system had flagged her biomedical request automatically, an unusual access alert routed straight to legal, and it was legal, not Curtis, who had passed word to the family's attorney within the hour. Unauthorized access of protected biomedical equipment data, outside her clearance, outside her role. Someone, somewhere, had noticed a floor nurse requesting a pump log through channels she had no business using, and had turned that fact itself into a weapon far more precise than anything Curtis had said in the review room. It didn't matter what the log showed. It only mattered that she had gone looking, and that going looking was in itself something that could be written up. She read the complaint standing at the nurse's station a second time, then a third, the way she'd read the transfer letter 2 days before, waiting for indignation to arrive somewhere behind the numbness and not quite managing it. She noticed, reading it a fourth time, that the language matched the transfer letter almost sentence for sentence, the same flattened, lawyered rhythm, the same careful absence of any word that could be argued with in a room. Whoever was writing these letters had done this before, or had learned very quickly how it was done, and either possibility made the ground under her feel less solid than it had a moment ago. The charge nurse delivered this one gently too, the way she'd delivered the last one, and suggested, kindly, carefully, that Maren take a few days, let this settle, let cooler heads look at the file without her name attached to every page of it. Not a suspension. Just a quiet, sensible stepping back, phrased so reasonably that refusing it would have looked like exactly the kind of thing that got nurses fired. Maren asked whether she'd still have any access at all, to the chart, to the floor, to anything, and watched the answer arrive in the careful pause before the charge nurse spoke, the kind of pause that told her everything the words themselves were too polite to say. Maren sat in her car in the staff lot afterward with the engine off, hands still on the wheel, watching her own breath fog faintly against the windshield in the cold. She had done everything right this time. She had spoken up instead of staying silent. She had chased evidence instead of trusting a feeling, and the machine had simply looked back at her, blank and honest and utterly useless, and handed her own name to the people trying to remove her. She thought about calling someone, her sister, a friend from nursing school, anyone who might tell her she wasn't losing her grip on what was real, and didn't reach for her phone. There wasn't a version of this she could compress into a phone call that wouldn't sound, even to someone who loved her, like the beginning of a breakdown. She sat there long enough for the windows to fog completely, long enough that the parking lot lights outside blurred into soft orange smears, and let herself, for just a few minutes, stop trying to solve anything at all. Her hands were still on the wheel at 10 and 2, an old habit from driving lessons a decade ago, and she noticed them there and didn't move them, because moving them meant deciding what to do next, and she didn't have anything left to decide with. Somewhere behind her, faintly, she could hear the automatic doors of the staff entrance sighing open and shut for someone else's shift change, someone else's ordinary night, the hospital continuing on exactly as it always did, indifferent to the particular shape of what had just happened to her inside it. She was still sitting there, watching nothing in particular through the windshield, when the transport van pulled up near the side entrance, its rear doors already open, a handler leading Bear down the ramp on a short lead toward a crate built into the back. He went easily enough for the first several steps, tail low, head down, the posture of an animal that had simply stopped fighting whatever was being decided for him. Then, at the very edge of the ramp, he stopped, planted, low, ears back, exactly the way he'd planted himself in a doorway on the first night she'd ever seen him, exactly the way he'd planted himself between Curtis and a hospital bed. The handler tugged gently. Bear didn't move. He stood there with his whole body braced against a threshold only he seemed to understand the meaning of, refusing a crate the way he'd once refused to leave an empty chair, and something in Maren went very quiet and very clear, the fog of the last hour burning off all at once. She got out of the car without deciding to, walked halfway across the lot, cold air biting at her face, and said it out loud to no one, to the handler who didn't understand what he was watching, to a dog who couldn't have understood a word of it and somehow seemed to be the only one who ever had. "You don't react to people," she said. "You react to what they reach for." The transport van didn't leave that night. The handler, unnerved by what he'd just watched, a decommissioned canine planting himself against a crate like it was a threshold worth dying on, radioed his supervisor instead of forcing it, and by the time the paperwork caught up with him, Harlan's daughter had already called the hospital, demanding to know why a dog nobody could explain was being shipped off before her father was even lucid enough to ask about him. Harlan, steadier now, backed her up himself, telling anyone who came near his bed that he wanted the dog kept on the floor until he could say his piece. It bought less than a day. It was enough. She asked the review board for 10 minutes, and they almost didn't give her that. She had no standing left to ask for anything, no assignment to Harlan's care, a complaint against her name still sitting unresolved in someone's inbox, a request that by every ordinary measure should have ended with her being walked out of the building instead of into a conference room. But Harlan asked too, in a voice that had gotten steadier every day since his transfer had been delayed by the complaint's own paperwork tangle, and a lucid patient's request carried a weight that a suspended nurse's did not. The board gave her 10 minutes, visibly against their better judgment, glancing at the clock as she came in, and Tova stood at the back of the room, with her arms folded, there because Maren had asked her to be, not because anyone had invited her. Room 412 had been cleared, and prepared for this the way a room gets prepared for something people don't quite want to admit is an experiment. The rolling table pushed against the wall, the chairs arranged along the perimeter, close enough to see and far enough not to interfere. Harlan propped up against his pillows near the window, watching the door with the alert, careful attention of a man who had spent 30 years on a bench, learning to read a room before it spoke. "I'm not asking you to believe me," Maren said, once the room had gone quiet enough to hear her, her voice steadier than she'd expected it to be. "I'm asking you to watch him. 4 minutes, that's all I need." Before they let her run it, someone read the old file into the record, the discharge notes from the K9 unit that had sat unexplained for days, 3 cold words on a page, finally given their history. Bear's handler had died of a cardiac event in the middle of a shift, collapsed in the passenger seat of a parked patrol car, and Bear had spent the following hours refusing to let anyone near the empty seat beside him, guarding a space that no longer held the person he'd been trained to protect. They'd called it instability, they'd called it a liability. Nobody in that old report had ever once called it grief. The room went very still after that. Maren watched something shift in the faces around the table, not belief yet, but the beginning of room for it, a softening in postures that had been braced against her for 2 days straight. Even the board chair, who had asked the question that ended the last meeting, sat back in her chair with her glasses pushed up into her hair, listening in a way she hadn't before. Somewhere behind Maren, Bear lay on the floor near the foot of the bed with his chin resting on his paws, utterly unbothered by the number of people now filling a room that had for days belonged mostly to him and one sleeping man. The rules were simple, and Tova had insisted on them, laying them out to the board herself in the flat, technical voice she used for everything, which somehow made them harder to argue with. Bear would stay in the room. 4 people, one at a time, none of them told the order in advance, each approaching the bed the same way, at the same pace, for the same handful of seconds. No one was to warn him, no one was to warn Bear either. If this was going to mean anything, it had to happen the same way it had happened every other time, without theater, without anyone in the room shaping the outcome by watching for it too closely. A board member asked, not unreasonably, what this would actually prove. Tova answered before Maren could. Nothing on its own. Patterns aren't proof. But 4 for 4 is a pattern worth watching happen instead of just hearing about. The first visitor went in, a hospital administrator neither Maren nor Curtis knew well, a stranger to all of it, chosen for exactly that reason, and Bear lifted his head, watched him cross the room, and settled back down before he'd even reached the bed. The administrator, visibly relieved, gave a small awkward nod to the room and stepped back to his chair, and someone at the table exhaled audibly. The second went in, same result, stillness. Maren felt her own pulse in her throat, watching, counting the seconds the way she'd once counted doses, twice, checking herself against a standard nobody else in the room could see. She kept her hands folded tight in her lap, aware of every board member's eyes moving between the dog and her face, weighing her reaction as carefully as they were weighing his. Harlan's daughter went third, flown in that morning, still in her travel clothes, exhaustion showing in the fine lines around her eyes, and Bear's tail actually moved against the floor, 2 soft thumps, before he lowered his head again, a small, unmistakable warmth in it that made even the skeptics at the table lean fractionally forward. Someone near the end of the table let out a breath they'd clearly been holding. 3 for 3. Maren felt the room's attention start to lean, almost imperceptibly, toward her side of the table. She didn't dare look at Curtis. She kept her eyes on Bear, on the slow, steady rise and fall of his ribs, willing the next 30 seconds to unfold exactly the way everyone before it had. Then it was Curtis's turn. He walked in with the same easy, apologetic warmth he'd carried into every room in this hospital so far, hands loose at his sides, his bandaged wrist tucked slightly out of sight. And for one terrible second, Maren thought the whole plan might fail, exactly the way the review board had failed her, that he would simply walk to the bed, and nothing would happen, and every ounce of ground she'd clawed back in the last 20 minutes would collapse in front of everyone watching, that she would be left standing in a room full of people who had almost believed her. She made herself keep breathing, slow, even, the same steady rhythm she used to coach anxious families through bad news, and waited. Bear came off the floor before Curtis reached the halfway point of the room. Same posture as the first night. Same low sound rising out of his chest, weight forward, eyes locked, every line of him coiled toward the exact same warning he had given 4 times before and been punished for every single time. This time there was no closed door. This time there was a room full of witnesses and a hospital administrator's sharp intake of breath, and Harlan sitting up straighter against his pillows with an expression that had stopped being confusion and started being recognition, a memory finally finding somewhere solid to land. The board chair had gone very pale, her pen frozen above her notepad, and for the first time in 2 days nobody in that room was looking at Maren at all. Curtis stepped back, 1 step, reflexive, before he could stop himself, and said, too fast, too loud, the sentence that would end up doing more damage to him than the bite ever had. I didn't even touch the machine. Nobody in that room had said a word about the pump. For a long moment, nobody in the room said anything at all. Then Harlan, from his pillows, said quietly, to no one and everyone, that he remembered now, all of it, clear as morning, and the board chair set down her pen and asked, for the first time since Maren had walked in, what he remembered. Harlan told them, slow and unhurried, his voice gaining certainty with every sentence instead of losing it, the nights that felt wrong for no reason he could name, the tiredness that came from nowhere, the son-in-law who was always so gentle about wanting a little time alone. The financial records came out over the following weeks, quietly, the way these things do once one thread has been pulled. Debts Curtis had kept from his wife and from Harlan both, a fading business, a will he'd been in a hurry to see settled. The hospital handed what it had to the police, and the rest wasn't Maren's to carry anymore. Harlan remembered more every day. He told his daughter, in his own words this time, what he'd once only managed to say half-conscious and holding a nurse's wrist, that he always felt worse after Curtis had sat with him alone, and had never once let himself finish that thought until someone else was finally willing to hear it. Maren came back to a floor that had her name on the schedule again, printed plain and ordinary at the top of the board, as if it had never come off. She checked on Harlan before her rounds, out of habit now more than duty, and found him sitting up, alert, asking after the dog before he asked after anything else. Bear lay in the doorway of 412 that morning, exactly where he always lay, sunlight coming warm through the blinds behind him. Nobody told him to move. Nobody needed to. A colleague, passing by with a coffee in hand, asked her how she'd known. Maren didn't answer right away. She looked down the hall to where Bear lay stretched across the doorway, sunlight warm along his back, and only then said that she hadn't known anything he had. She'd simply stopped explaining it away.